Let me start by thanking the organizers for the kind invitation. Um, my name is Thomas Spencer. I'm a fellow at TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute, based in Delhi. I will be presenting this together with my colleague Ruchi Gupta. I'm an economist. She has a training in social work, so we're going to try and combine these perspectives. So the title of the presentation is One Eye in the Telescope and One in the Microscope, a macro and micro discussion of coal transition in India. So the micro discussion will be the case study of Betul, which my colleague has been conducting. And the macro discussion will be some reflections from me as an economist interested in the history of energy systems and the future of energy systems on the issue of coal transition in India. So the question is, why are we interested in coal transition? Obviously, in discussions in different countries, it has been one of the most salient areas where the nexus of social justice and energy transition is the strongest today. So we can think about the discussion in Germany around closing down the lignite plants in East Germany, for example. So I'm going to start with 3 or 4 slides presenting some macro reflections on the issue of coal transition in India. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Ruchi, who will present some micro results from the district of Betul in Madhya Pradesh. So without further ado, now I wanted to make one important point by looking back at the history of energy systems, which is that in a long-term historical comparison, India is not that dependent on coal at all. So on this graph, I have put 4 countries, UK, US, China, and India. The vertical axis is national coal production per capita in energy units, and the horizontal axis is national GDP per capita. And it's a time series, so each dot has a third dimension which is not represented here, which is time. So the UK's coal production per capita peaked in 1913. US coal production per capita peaked in 1918. China has peaked, probably, in my view, in 2013, and India's is down here. You can see that there are orders of magnitude between the per capita dependency on coal in the UK in the 19th century and India today. Why is this? If you look back at the history of the energy mix, in the early, say, 20th century, the primary energy consumption of the UK was almost 100% coal. There was very little oil, very little natural gas. In comparison, in India, even though per capita GDP is roughly where the UK was at the beginning of the 20th century, we consume oil, we consume natural gas already. So there has been a transition in the energy mix that late industrializers have been able to access other fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, at points in their development pathway where these fossil fuels were not available to early industrializers. The other reason is the technology level. If you look at the energy conversion technologies that early industrializers were using, they had conversion efficiencies that were at least an order of magnitude less than those that we use today. So you extracted a lot less economic value from the fossil fuels that were used in those days. And the third reason is economic structure. Early industrializers, with the exception of China as a late industrializer, tended to be much more dependent on manufacturing than is the case today. So this raises the question, looking back, early industrializers' dependence on coal as an energy source was also evident in economic data. So here I've put, for the UK since 1850, the share of mining and quarrying in national employment, excluding oil and gas. You can see that mining and quarrying at the beginning of the 20th century made up almost 8% of national employment. The UK economy employed millions of coal miners. And this has now declined to less than half a percentage point. At the beginning of the 20th century, mining and quarrying made up almost 7% of UK GDP. This is again essentially coal. beginning of the 20th century, coal made up almost 100% of fuel imports into UK electricity production. So the question is, given this level of economic dependence on coal, why wasn't these transitions that you can see here more disruptive? And my answer to this is that they were part of a much, much larger macroeconomic transition that was taking place at the same time. The biggest aspect of this macroeconomic transition was the decline in agriculture in national employment, from about 45% in 1870 to less than 1% today, and the massive growth of manufacturing employment and then service sector employment. So it didn't matter that you were transitioning out of coal as a source of employment, because much, much larger transitions were taking place at the same time. The other thing that was happening is that for a period in time, GDP per capita and the wages, inflation-adjusted wages of productive employees, so workers in the productive sectors like manufacturing and industry, grew essentially in lockstep. So there was a period in economic history where economic growth contributed also to wage growth of manufacturing employees. And that went along with the collapse in inequality in the developed countries over the course of the 20th century. At least up to about 1980, the Gini coefficients came down very strongly. So there were much larger transitions going on, and those transitions had the effect of raising the incomes of workers and of reducing inequality. Why are we worried about this in India now? So I mentioned that these transitions were just getting swamped by much, much larger macroeconomic transitions that were taking place. This macroeconomic transition is still to take place in India. So in this graph, I've put GDP per capita. On the vertical axis, I've put employment share of agriculture. The grey dots, which you can hardly see, are every country in the World Development Indicators database of the World Bank, going back every year that is available for those countries. And the black line is the line of best fit for that data. So you can see that as GDP per capita grows, employment share of agriculture drops precipitously. So India is at about 47% employment share of agriculture. This was roughly where the US was in 1870. You have to go back to before 1700 to find an employment share of agriculture of this level in the UK. If India is to grow its GDP, then agricultural employment, economic history suggests, must decline. So if we had to reach 5 trillion economy, roughly doubling per capita income, this would imply, if you just follow the line of best fit suggested by economic history, that the employment share of agriculture would have to fall by 10 to 15 percentage points. That's 100 to 150 million people who would have to find employment elsewhere. If we compare this graph, which shows GDP per capita with production workers' real incomes per capita, you see a completely different picture to what we saw in the developed world before 1980. So we are not growing incomes in the same way that appeared to happen. If you look at employment shares over the last 20 years, this is 1990 to 1995, 1995 to 2000, 2000 to 2005, and so on. The largest transition out of agriculture happened when industry employment was growing fastest, which was in the 2000s. And it appears that this transition is slowing down. Transition out of agriculture in the 2010s was much slower than it was in the 2000s. So there is a question of whether India's transition is slowing down as well. So this time it's different, maybe. A lot of economists are asking what is happening in capitalism that means that we see inequality increasing, and what does it mean for the development pathways of countries like India, which still have so much transition to do. There are a number of theories out there of why capitalism seems to be producing more unequal outcomes today than it seemed in the 1950s or 60s. One is what they call skills-biased technical change, which means that essentially low-skilled workers are much less valued today than they were previously. Labor is no longer technology is no longer labor-enhancing but labor-replacing. Certainly in the manufacturing and potentially increasingly in retail and services if we think about the growth of Amazon, Walmart, Flipkart, etc. Globalization is a fact. You have much more competition. There's more low-skilled workers in the world now and you have to compete with them. Financial globalization means you can't be as progressive with tax rates. Services globalization, which India specializes in, is not labor-intensive and it's highly skilled. There is what economists are calling premature deindustrialization, where we see in late industrializers, with the exception of East Asia, particularly China, much less importance of the manufacturing sector in national output and employment. So the question is, how do you create low-skilled jobs? I like this quote from Danny Roderick's paper, Premature Deindustrialization, in which he concludes, for late industrializers, manufacturing, employment and activity have gone missing in a big way. There are some India-specific factors which make the pathway maybe more difficult. Education system is not very good. There's lots of distortions in what economists call factor markets, so labor, land, capital, and so on, which means that industrial production is more challenging. The public provision of public goods like infrastructure, facilitation of urbanization through proper infrastructure provision is not very good. So all of these things are maybe making India's development path more challenging than what we saw in those big transitions that occurred in the UK and US. So I'm going to conclude these 4 slides with my essential message, which is that if we are worried about employment transition in the coal sector, there are much bigger things to worry about in India. Of course, we can look at sectoral policies to facilitate coal sector transition, but unless you are able to grow employment for alternative sources of employment, those policies, in my view, will not be particularly effective. So I think we have to really distinguish the equity issues of what we call coal transition in the developed world with the equity issues of coal transition in the developing world. Now, Ruchi will provide a completely different perspective, which is on the ground, what does it look like in the district of Betul?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for setting the context. And so I think before we begin, I'll just would like to give you a brief background. Now, we had recently undertaken this visit to Betul, which is in Madhya Pradesh, and herein we have attempted to summarize the impact that the restructuring of the workforce has had on coal-dependent communities. Now, as you can see, the slide says the case in point is Satpura Thermal Power Plant, which is a state unit of the Madhya Pradesh Power Generation Company Limited. And the year in which it was set up in 1967, it was the biggest power project in the state. Subsequent to which, if you look at the Patakhera coal mines in Betul district, interestingly, Patakhera coal mines are very old mines. In fact, at the time of their operation in 1969, they were controlled by the National Coal Development Corporation, much before Coal India set in. Also a brief background that all the mines in the Patakhera coal fields are, all of them are largely underground mines. And this region falls in the Satpura Malegat reserve area, which is a rich forest land as well as now a rich wildlife corridor as well. So we'll quickly go through the transitions here, how we see the power plants coming up. Now, with 5 units of 62.5 megawatts set up, Patakhera served as a captive fuel source. Subsequent to the oil shocks that the country experienced in 70s and about early 80s, more units of the power plants were set up, considering that coal was given more importance in the electricity generation in the country. And you see, responding to the needs of the power plant 4 more mines, underground mines were opened up in Satpura region, in Patakera region. Gradually, you will find that 2010, 2013 onwards, mines started to close down. Now, either the mines that closed down were due to exhaustion of reserves, or the reserves that were left were actually uneconomical or unviable to be mined. So I'll just bring in a short note here, which will come up again. So while during the closure of mines also, the unions even now continue to resist the closure of these mines on the context that there were enough reserves that were mineable. We'll park that for the subsequent slides. Coming here again in 2013-14, they had 2 more units of 220 megawatts set up. But the Patakera mines actually met the requirements for about 6 units, 312 units here and 830 and 200 units. So overall, this served 512 megawatts. And later, the Satpura power plant actually started to procure coal from the other neighboring regions of western coal fields. So, sorry. Yeah, I'll do that. So why we're mentioning this here is because primarily if we look at the context in Betul, Betul is predominantly a scheduled tribe area, and large portions of the district is under forest, and primarily it is an agricultural dominated district. It is also one of the key aspirational districts identified by Niti Aayog, and mining and electricity generation continues to form the backbone of the economy. So here is a quick look at the coal requirements. The bar graph in blue shows the requirements from the power plant, and the line graph shows how much the coal mines of Patakera were able to meet the demand. Quickly now, since we're discussing the employment scenario, we'll quickly just look at some of the interesting timelines that we've observed in the field. In 1969, you'll find that there was a lot of influx of migrants into the coal region for work. The tribals then were not very forthcoming to work in the coal fields. However, with the setting up of the National Wage Agreement Board, the wage board ensured that there is a fixed pay for the workers, there are regular and periodic revision of wages, which attracted actually a lot of migrants from other places. Now, because of the wage board also, the wages in the coal mines were far higher than wages in the agricultural areas. But in 1984 was the last mass recruitment drive that the area witnessed. 1986, we find that mine mechanizations was introduced in the underground mines. Prior to the mine mechanization, the underground mines dominated the national coal production landscape, which accounted for about 76% of the national output. But subsequent to mine mechanization, what actually happened was the output from open cast mines far superseded the underground mines. Primarily, the reason that were identified by the officials in the area was most of the machineries were imported, and the cost to maintain the machineries or even availability of spare parts was a problem. So the consequences that we see was, yes, the output per man shift did increase, but the cost also increased, and they became very viable. Now, with the regular revision in wages, the wage cost increased, and of course, with the introduction of mechanization, the capital cost increased. Thereafter, we see a shift in hiring of contract workers. Now, contract workers were more like casual workers; they were daily wage earners, and with definitely lower social security benefits and higher insecurity of tenure. And thereafter, we see the only regular hiring that was done were largely on grounds of compassionate employment, given either due to death or medical unfitness of the employees, or to people who were affected by land acquisition. Here is again a quick look at the declining workforce both at the coal mines as well as the thermal power plant. And on the right-hand side, you see the recruitment types. You know, with the last 5 years, you see the number of regular forced recruitment has only been given to the dependents of those who either died while during work or who were medically unfit. Fresh recruitments only limited itself to statutory positions. And this is based on the current age profiles in the Patakera mines. This is how the retirement profile looks like. And maybe in another 5 years, the number of employees would come down even lesser than 2,000. So we'll quickly try to sum up here with an impact slide. We would just like to mention that there is an interconnectedness of issue. It's very difficult to separate out various factors, but largely we've seen two key drivers in the region. One is the impact of the cost adjustments, as we've seen in the previous slides, that has taken place in the region. And second was the impact of slowed coal production. Now, as we had earlier mentioned, yes, mines were closing, and 3 mines are currently being proposed to open. But there are less likely chances that these mines will get any kind of environmental clearances also, considering that they are now part of the reserve forest area. So what the impact of cost adjustments, quickly we'll just mention it here, is of course with the decrease in the regular workforce, which is almost a 35% decrease over the last decade, and with the increase in the contractual workforce, you would find that there is a perceived reduced flow of income in the economy, and this has also impacted the indirect and the induced employment and enterprises in the area. And of course, we have come across cases where there is a resistance amongst workers to relocate, primarily because these workers have been there for generations now. The 4th, 5th generations are currently there. On the other hand, if you look at the impact of this slowed coal production, yes, the state revenues we have seen in the last 3 years have come down from 800 million to about 500 million in the last 3 years, directly from coal production based on royalty and cess. Also, there, as the workers were attracted to the region, so were the traders, and subsequently now the impact of the slowdown is felt by the traders also. So here is, here are the two key indicators that we've actually tried to understand the kind of social distress that is happening in the region. Yes, it has the level of illegal and subsistence mining is on the rise. Increase in crimes, particularly of burglaries and thefts, have been reported. And yes, there are cases of anxiety and depression, particularly among the youth. The labor market, definitely because of this restructuring, has been skewed. A lot of youth in the area are largely unemployed. It's because, yes, they are from the generations of coal miners and who now refuse to take up work on contract basis. There is reported cases of distressed migration because there is no other alternative, economic alternative in the area. And yes, there is a reduction in the indirect and induced jobs, and even the effect has been felt on the nearby village economies. So I think keeping the time constraint in mind, we just would like to conclude that for us, the way forward is a larger multi-stakeholder engagement with all the communities there, so that we come to a solution which is more region specific, which is more inclusive, and which is more sustainable.